Okay, this is the audio for We Are All Americans, the Latin Americanization of Racial Stratification in the USA by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. So, racial stratification in the US has operated on biracial lines of white and non-white for centuries. And for demographic and historical reasons, this dichotomy centers on a white or black binary. Non-whites have shared similar struggles of colonialism, oppression, exploitation, and racialization that restrict their access to the benefits that are accessible to whites, such as good housing, decent jobs, and quality education. Racial stratification and how it operates has changed since the civil rights era. This does not mean that racism is over, as the author argues that the biracial order has evolved into a complex triracial system, with whites at the top, honorary whites next, and lastly, the collective black at the bottom of the hierarchy. There's a figure in the book that kind of illuminates how he's constructing this triracial system. So as a triracial system, race conflict is filtered by the group that's in the middle, in the same way as social class operates. Meaning, there's a lot of social class inequality, but the position of the middle class complicates our social understandings. For instance, politicians always talk about the middle class and issues that they face or are concerned about, but we rarely, if ever, hear about a promise to address the issues of those who are poor. And the rare people who do mention the poor or advocate for them are marginalized or labeled as socialists in our modern political climate. As the middle class complicates discussions of social class and makes inequality seem less of a problem. So the author's arguing that in a triracial system, the middle group, or the honorary whites, buffer race conflict in the culture. He also argues that color becomes more important in the system within racial groups to differentiate people and privilege those who are closest to white or are light-skinned. This system also produces more nationalistic appeals, as some decry the racial past and claim to be beyond race or just Americans. So why would a triracial system emerge in the US? Well, his first argument is that the demography of the nation is changing. Not only is the population growing, the racial proportions are shifting. The white population has been dropping since 1950 and will continue to do so in coming years. So in a few decades, whites will be less than 50% of the population, according to projections by demographer Dudley Poston Jr. So racial minorities, if all totaled together, will be the majority population, but whites will still be the largest ethnic or racial group in the US for some time, especially in the aging population, which makes sense when you look at how racial inequalities affect our lifespans. Also, Bonilla Silva argues that what is also emerging in the post-civil rights era is a kinder, gentler white supremacy, where the maintenance of systemic white privilege is accomplished socially, economically, and politically through institutional, covert, and apparently non-racial practices. There's also this accompanying ideology of colorblind racism that denies the salience of race and scorns those who talk about it. He argues that some try to ignore the impact of race and instead again argue, we're just Americans. So race relations have also become globalized in recent years. Once almost all white, Western nations have changed as the need for laborers have facilitated the immigration of dark-skinned laborers, which has then formed into an underclass across these Western cultures. Minorities can then develop an internal racial structure to maintain white power and have a strange racial ideology that combines ethno-racialism with a race-blind ideology like we have in the US. And he argues this ideology of colorblindness is just going to increase and become more prevalent in Western nations. Also, the convergence of political and ideological actions of Republicans, conservative commentators, activists, and others have created a space for transforming the way that we collect data about race. Basically, if you're saying that race no longer functions as something that's important, is no longer a prevalent issue in society, then that can justify not doing research on race, not collecting data about race. And that is something he's really concerned about because, again, if we can't collect the data, we can't see how significant those inequalities remain. So a look at the data. There's some objective indicators of the standing of the three racial groups that he's created here that show some significant gaps between them, something that is borne out of the data even more since the article was written. But there's also the subjective indicators of the consciousness of the three racial strata. And so Bonilla Silva argues that the gaps in the objective indicators affect self-definitions, with honorary whites benefiting from a heightened social position in the culture over the collective black. So they may distance themselves from the collective black in order to try to gain a higher social position. So he expects that social interaction among members of the three racial strata will increase as more friendships and intimate partnerships arise between whites and honorary whites than between whites and the collective blacks, kind of reinforcing his argument about how the system then structures and upholds white supremacy. So the triracial order. There's a variety of subjective indicators that signal the emergence of internal stratification among racial minorities. So here he's arguing that some racial minorities will develop attitudes or racial attitudes that are similar to whites, while others will develop racial attitudes similar to blacks. So he points to data on residential segregation and interracial marriage to try to illustrate that whites are more likely to live near and marry honorary whites than members of the collective black, which he uses to support his argument. So he predicts consequences for race relations as a result of the new triracial order in America, such as that racial politics will change from us versus them ideology to that of colorblindness as it takes hold and becomes more significant in our culture. He fears the result is that the state will care less about race as a factor and will stop collecting data that can document and measure the impacts of race on many social factors. He also argues that since so much of history and culture focused on whites versus blacks, the black racial identity will not vanish with color blindness, but a new order will result in shifting of all racial identities, as some groups who strive for a higher position in the racial hierarchy will adopt the white supremacist ideology that mobility is dependent upon whiteness or near whiteness. So some racial minorities will break away from the collective black in order to not be as marginalized, and may claim to be past ethnicity to be simply an American. So last, he argues that the new stratification will be more effective in maintaining white supremacy than the dichotomy of the past, as whites will still be considered the top of the racial hierarchy, but they will face fewer charges of racism, while the inequality continues. So the weakness of the triracial order, or how to disrupt this process, lies in the fact that while honorary whites may be privileged over the collective black, they're still honorary and thus racialized and still subject to unequal treatment. He argues that the collective black has to be the heart of the movement to challenge the racial order, but also says that the way to make these challenges more successful is to reach out to progressive Asian and Latinx organizations to try to build coalitions to oppose the new triracial order, to remind people that while they might have an honorary or heightened social status, they are still subjected to a hierarchy in which they are marginalized and not seen as equal.